What do you do if you're a local school teacher and you're frustrated over a repeated failure to pass a government civil service exam? If you answered, declare yourself the brother of Jesus and establish your own kingdom within the borders of China, then boy, do we have a story for you. Today, we're going to take a look at how one man's delirious vision led 500,000 Chinese to rebel against the Qing Dynasty. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other parts of Chinese history you would like to hear about. Now, let's go to China. In 1837, Xiuquan claimed that while convalescing after a nervous breakdown, he had been visited by a heavenly father who took him to heaven. Hong was a humble schoolteacher from a small village in the Guangzhou province with lofty aspirations of being a bureaucrat. Getting that job required passing a civil service exam. However, Hong had some trouble with the test, by which we mean he failed it 4 times. He had worked so hard and put so much pressure on himself that in 1837, it was his 3rd failure that actually triggered the nervous breakdown which gave him his vision. In the vision, Hong claimed his heavenly father introduced him to his celestial family. He was then asked to slay some demons that were occupying heaven, a mission he saw himself accomplish with the help of his newfound family and a celestial army. The vision went on for 40 full days, and when Hong returned, or recovered from delirium if you prefer, he was a new, more spiritual man. In 1843, after failing the civil service exam for the 4th time, Hong's cousin urged him to read a Christian text called Liang Afa's Good Words to Admonish the Age. The text made quite an impression on Xiuquan, and he quickly decided it was the key to interpreting his previous visions. Hong reasoned that the heavenly father of his vision had been the Christian God, and his celestial brother had been Jesus. Moreover, he came to believe that the demons God wanted him to drive out of heaven represented the Confucian and Buddhist idols worshipped throughout China. Xiuquan baptized himself and started presenting himself as the younger brother of Jesus. He claimed it was his divine duty to bring down the Manchu-led Qing Dynasty, which he saw as rife with sinful behavior. He began to preach, and he must have been onto something because by 1850 he had attracted a large following known as the Society of God Worshippers, and even his own mobilized troops. In the earliest days of his ministry, when Xiuquan was first sharing his visions, developing his doctrine, and publicizing his mandate, he had 2 followers. The first was a cousin named Hong Rengan. Another distant cousin, Fang Yuanshang, was also an early convert. Like Hong Xiuquan, both men would baptize themselves and rid their surroundings of any Buddhist or Confucian idols, actions which at the time would have been understood as protests against the Confucian education system, the civil service exams, and the Qing Dynasty. The 3 men then began preaching to their family and friends. As Xiuquan and his earliest followers spread his message, the leader decided to articulate his thoughts in a work called Exhortations to Worship the One True God. This text mashed up the Christian teachings of Liang Afa, which had prompted Hong's own conversion, with ideas that resembled early forms of communism. For example, one passage in the exhortation states, "When people of this earth keep nothing for their private use, but give all things to God for all to use in common, then every place shall have equal shares, and everyone be clothed and fed." Later, Chinese leaders and academics, including Mao Zedong, have seen Hong's views as a forerunner of the communism that eventually took hold of the nation. Xiuquan's teachings advocated the proto-communist idea of shared property. He also promised free land to his followers, which was especially popular after a series of famines struck China between 1847 and 1849. His following grew quickly, and by 1851, the government felt it had to respond. There were several skirmishes and even a full-scale battle with imperial troops. Then, on January 11, 1851, Hong founded the Heavenly Kingdom of Transcendent Peace, or the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Qing forces battled the God worshippers several times in 1851 and 1852, with both sides incurring heavy losses. In early 1853, Taiping forces set out to take the city of Nanjing, where they already had roughly 2 million followers. By March 19th of that year, the operation was complete. Taiping forces captured Nanjing, and the God worshippers made the city their capital. After establishing their new capital, the Taiping forces split into 3. One contingent went west, one stayed at Nanjing to defend their stronghold, and the third went north to confront the emperor at his own capital in Beijing. That's ballsy, taking it to the man. The efforts to conquer Beijing were eventually abandoned, and Xiuquan turned to securing his own capital instead. Hong Xiuquan and his earliest followers, including Hong Rengen and Fang Yuanshan, were Hakka. Hakka were a subset of Chinese culture that spoke their own dialect and had a long history of separating themselves from mainstream Chinese society. They were mostly poor laborers, and Hakka women didn't bind their feet like other Chinese women. The Taiping Rebellion had a strong Hakka presence, where men and women were considered equally capable. However, they weren't considered equal citizens. Despite this, Hakka men and women fought shoulder to shoulder against the Qing throughout the rebellion. Surrounded mostly by servants and concubines, Xiuquan became increasingly isolated at Nanjing. The Manchu Qing Dynasty focused all their efforts on Nanjing, and in 1864, they took it back. Hong Xiuquan is believed to have been killed in the siege, though the exact details of how he met his end are unknown. Some accounts hold that, sensing the end, Hong committed suicide. Others hold that he died of poisoning, which may have been an assassination, but could just have been food poisoning. While the true cause is lost to history, what we do know is that Xiuquan's body was found wrapped in a cloth in one of the city sewers. Hong's death marked the end of Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Those of his followers that escaped fled north and were eventually defeated in 1866. Before settling at Nanjing in 1852, the leadership of the Taiping Rebellion was based at Thistle Mountain. Whenever Hong Xiuquan was away, most of the duties and responsibilities of leadership fell to one person, Yang Xiuqing. Yang was a former coal miner who had worked his way to a high position in the Taiping leadership hierarchy, even being considered a vessel for the word of Christ. However, Xiuqing began to behave erratically and even arranged the overthrow of Fang Yuanshan. By 1856, his thirst for power had grown so out of control that he demanded to be made an equal to Hong Xiuquan, even implying that the Heavenly Father wanted Hong to resign in favor of himself. Concerned, Hong ordered Xiuqing to be banished and sent his most trusted commander to remove him. Xiuqing refused to leave, and as a result, he would be killed, along with his family and supporters in September of 1856. In addition to Hong Xiuquan, the rebellion assigned kings to each faction, west, east, south, and north. The kings were competitive and contentious, and Xiuquan's lack of ability to control them weakened the Taiping cause. After Yang Xiuqing, who was also known as the East King, was executed, Hong began a general purge of the Taiping leadership hierarchy that would last for nearly a decade. Rivalries over who held power and question about Hong Xiuquan's level of authority regularly caused civil unrest and undermined their entire effort. By the 1850s, the Society of the Worshippers of God were stockpiling large quantities of gunpowder, and by 1853 they had access to Western-style sidearms. The troops, however, didn't really take to them and rejected the idea of fighting with muskets. One commander reportedly said, "I am beginning to get old now, but give me a good spear, and I am still not afraid to meet any 10 of them." Despite the preferences of the soldiers, defeating the Qing Dynasty would require the use of modern firearms. In 1853, the god worshippers would attack Huiqing, which was a Qing munitions hold. They were hoping to steal a large quantity of black powder before it could get to Qing forces. They were not successful. By the time the Taiping Rebellion was over, Hong Xiuquan and his followers had fought their way through 17 Chinese provinces, razing over 600 cities. While both the god worshippers and the imperial forces would take massive casualties, they were far from the only ones to suffer. The efforts expended in the war caused millions to die from starvation and disease. Hong's rebellion promised agricultural success and prosperity, but it didn't deliver. According to one missionary who saw China in the 1860s, the country was a picture of the most lamentable desolation. Entire districts that were once covered in agriculture and studded with towns and villages were left deserted. The buildings were in ruins, and the fields had grown into wilds that were more suitable for occupation by wolves rather than people. Modern historians estimate the fighting, failed policies, and general devastation brought about by the Taiping Rebellion ultimately led to the demise of 20 million people. Hong Tianguifu was appointed successor to the throne of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom in 1853. He was only 15 when his father perished in 1864 and was cared for by Hong Rengen, who had been appointed the boy's regent. At the very end of his life, Tianguifu was staying at Nanjing with a Taiping commander named Li Xiuquan. The two were taken captive when the Qing recaptured the city, and both met their fate in the aftermath of the battle. Hong Rengen, who had hoped to save the Taiping efforts with Tianguifu's help, also died around the time of the siege. So what do you think? Did the Qing Dynasty Rebellion ever have a chance? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.